Margaret Calloway had been reviewing compensation deduction files for 11 days straight when the name appeared on her screen for the 17th time. She was sitting in her new office on the 14th floor of Dalthorpe and Associates Financial Group's headquarters in Cincinnati, Ohio, a corner office with a window that looked out over the Ohio River, and the name that kept appearing was the name of the man who had signed her original offer letter 8 months ago. The man who had called her into his office on a Tuesday in March and explained, with the particular calm of someone who has rehearsed the conversation, that her performance bonus would reflect a discretionary adjustment. The man who had slid a paper across the desk showing a figure of $30,000 and said the number was final. I had already done the math. My contract specified $40,000. The difference was $10,000. I looked at the figure. I looked at him. His name was Gerald Fitch. He was vice president of operations, and he was smiling the way people smile when they believe the conversation is already over. I said, "Can you point me to the policy document that outlines this adjustment?" He said, "It's standard. Everyone at your level takes the reduction." I said, "I'd like to see the written policy." He said, "Margaret, let's not make this complicated." I reviewed the full pattern. That was the moment, not the deduction itself, not the $10,000 that disappeared from a check I had earned across 8 months of 60-hour weeks, but that phrase, "Let's not make this complicated." I had heard a version of that sentence before. I had heard it in different rooms from different people across more years than I wanted to count. And every time I had heard it, I had made the same mistake. I had let it be uncomplicated. I had walked out of the room and said nothing and absorbed the loss as though the loss were mine to absorb. This time I walked out of the room, but I did not say nothing. I opened a document on my personal laptop that evening and I began to write down every detail I could remember about the conversation. The date, the time, the exact words, the specific figure. I saved the document in a folder I had created 3 years earlier in a different city for a different reason. The folder was labeled Record. 6 months later, Dalthorpe and Associates promoted me to Senior Compliance Officer. My first assignment was auditing all compensation deductions across the previous fiscal year. Gerald Fitch's name appeared on the audit list 17 times. I opened the file. I contacted HR. I said, "I need every supporting document for each of these entries, every policy reference, every approval signature." HR said they would get back to me by end of week. I said, "I need them by tomorrow morning." I was the compliance auditor now. It was my job to make things complicated. Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you've ever been told that you're making things difficult when all you were really doing was asking for what you were owed, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about a missing $10,000. It's about a pattern. And patterns, once you know how to read them, tell you everything about the people who created them. To understand why sitting in that office with Gerald Fitch's file felt the way it felt, I have to take you back, 12 years back, to a version of my life that Gerald Fitch had nothing to do with, and yet somehow felt exactly the same. I was 27 years old when my father's company went into receivership. I was living in Columbus at the time, working 2 jobs, and taking night classes toward a business administration degree I had been pursuing for 4 years by then. My mother had called me on a Wednesday evening to tell me the news, and her voice had that particular flatness that meant she was reading from a script someone else had written for her. The company, Callaway Freight Solutions, which my grandfather had founded in 1971 and which my father had run for 19 years, had accumulated debt across 3 consecutive years of poor management decisions, and the receivership process had been initiated by the primary creditor, a regional bank in Dayton whose name I still remember, First Mercantile of the Miami Valley. My father had known for 14 months. He had not told me. What he had told me 3 years earlier was that the $18,000 he had withdrawn from the account my grandmother had set up as my college fund, money that had been accumulating since I was 6 years old, had been reinvested into the company. He had framed it as a contribution, as though I had agreed to it, as though the decision had been a family one. The business needed liquidity, he said, sitting at the kitchen table the afternoon I came home and asked where the money had gone. "You understand that, Margaret, you're studying business." I said, "That was my tuition money." He said, "The company is the family. When the company does well, everyone does well." I said, "Dad, I needed that for next semester." He looked at me and he said, "You're young, you'll find a way." My brother Daniel was 24 at the time. He was not in school. He was not working a second job. He had been given a salaried position at Callaway Freight as a logistics coordinator, a title that came with health insurance coverage and a company car and a salary of $52,000, which I knew because I had seen the payroll summary my father had left on the kitchen counter. Daniel had not studied logistics. Daniel had not studied anything in particular. Daniel was the son. That was credential enough. My mother's position on the matter of the missing $18,000 was that I was being ungrateful. Her exact words, delivered over the phone the following week when I called to discuss it a second time, were, "Your father is under enormous pressure and the last thing he needs is you adding to it." I said, "Mom, that money was mine." She said, "It was a family decision, Margaret. You're part of this family." I said, "I was 6 when Grandma started that fund. No one asked me." She said, "You're being dramatic." That was the sentence, dramatic. I stored it the same way I would later learn to store everything, quietly, completely, without visible reaction. There was a woman in my night class named Patricia Owens. She worked in the compliance department at a regional hospital during the day and took her MBA classes at night, the same as me. Patricia was 41 to my 27, and she had a particular way of listening to a problem that made you feel like she was already several steps ahead of your explanation, but was polite enough to let you finish. I told her what had happened with the college fund. "Not all of it. Enough," she said. "Do you have any documentation of the original account, your grandmother's name on it, your name?" I said I thought my grandmother might have kept statements. Patricia said, "If you have documentation, you have options. It doesn't expire just because the money is already gone." I wrote down the phrase, "documentation options doesn't expire." I wrote it in the margin of my accounting textbook. I kept that textbook for 11 years. The night I found out about the receivership, the night my mother called with her scripted voice, I sat in my apartment in Columbus, and I opened my laptop, and I searched for the specific phrase that Patricia Owens had used in my accounting class 4 years earlier. The phrase was regulatory compliance certification. I had heard it. I had written it down. I had kept it folded in the back of my mind the same way you keep a map you haven't needed to use yet. That night I unfolded it. I found the program I was looking for at 11:47 p.m. I wrote down the name on a piece of paper, the Institute for Regulatory and Compliance Studies, affiliated with Ohio State University's Fisher College of Business. I folded the paper and put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 3 years. The application process for the Regulatory Compliance Certificate program required 2 professional references, a written statement of purpose, and a $450 application fee that I did not have in the month I first attempted to apply. I had been working the 2 jobs, a daytime administrative role at a property management firm and an evening shift at a copy and print center, and between rent, utilities, and the remaining tuition on the business degree I was still completing, $450 was the equivalent of 11 days of groceries. I held the application on my laptop, complete in every other field, for 6 weeks. My father's receivership had moved into asset liquidation by then. The family home in Dayton was listed. The logistics coordinator position my brother Daniel had held was eliminated along with every other salaried role in the company. Daniel moved back into the house that was being sold, and my parents began a period of domestic financial reorganization that I understood meant they needed help, and that I understood further meant they would ask me for it. My mother called in February. I remember because I was on my lunch break at the property management office, eating at my desk when she called. She said, "We need you to come home for a few weeks, Margaret, just to help sort things out." I said, "Mom, I'm working 2 jobs." She said, "Daniel is really struggling. He doesn't do well with stress." I said, "I can't take time off right now." She said, and these are the exact words, "I suppose your career is more important than your family." I sat with that sentence for the rest of the afternoon. Then I transferred $450 from my savings account, savings I had been building for 14 months, and submitted the application. 3 weeks later, I received a rejection letter. The program was at capacity. I was waitlisted for the following cohort, which would begin in September. I sat on the floor of my apartment, not dramatically. Just physically, I sat down on the floor because I had been standing at my kitchen counter when I read the email and my legs felt suddenly impractical. I sat there for approximately 7 minutes. Then I got up, and I made a note in my calendar for the September cohort application window, and I closed my laptop and I went back to work. The person who eventually helped me get off the waitlist was not a family member. He was a man named Dr. Raymond Solis, an adjunct instructor in my business administration program who taught an evening course in organizational behavior. I had taken his class in my third year and had done well in it, and when I went to his office hours in March, not to ask for help with the waitlist, but to ask about a paper I was writing on corporate governance structures, he asked me what I planned to do after I completed the degree. I told him about the Regulatory Compliance Certificate program. I told him I was on the waitlist. He said, "I know someone on the admissions committee there. Let me make a call." I said, "I don't want to take a spot someone else earned." He looked at me the way Patricia Owens had looked at me 4 years earlier, the way people look at you when they see something you haven't caught up to yet about yourself, and he said, "Margaret, making a call is how half the people in every program got in. The other half were waitlisted and too proud to let anyone make a call." I was admitted to the September cohort 3 weeks later. I started the program on September 9th of that year. I was 29 years old. My mother called that same week. She did not call to ask how school was going. She called because Daniel needed help moving into a new apartment and could I contribute to the first month's deposit. I said I could not. She said she hoped I understood what I was doing to the family. I said I understood completely. I hung up. I opened my textbook and I read the first chapter of the program's foundational course in regulatory framework and financial compliance. I highlighted a passage about documentation standards. In the margin, I wrote, "This is how it works." That was the fall that I also, for the first time in my life, met with a financial advisor, a woman named Claire Heston at a small independent firm called Landmark Wealth Partners in Columbus. I had $3,200 in savings, a part-time graduate program commitment, 2 jobs, and a brother who had asked me 3 times in 6 months for money I did not have. Claire looked at my numbers without expression and said, "You need to stop being everyone's emergency fund before you have one yourself." I had never heard it said that plainly. I wrote it down. I put it next to the passage in my textbook about documentation standards. The Regulatory Compliance Certificate program ran for 18 months, structured across 6 intensive modules delivered on weekends and weekday evenings. I completed it while maintaining both jobs until the 14th month, at which point I gave notice at the Copy and Print Center and took a junior compliance analyst position at a firm called Hargrove Risk Solutions in Columbus. The salary was $47,000, less than my brother had been making as a logistics coordinator at a company that no longer existed, which I noted without satisfaction and without mentioning to anyone in my family. The benefits included health insurance coverage for the first time in 3 years, and I spent 20 minutes on the phone with the HR coordinator, confirming exactly what the insurance policy covered, because I had been paying out of pocket for a specialist appointment related to a joint condition in my left knee, and the cost of that appointment alone had been $340. My direct supervisor at Hargrove Risk Solutions was a woman named Adrienne Park, Senior Compliance Director, who had spent 14 years in regulatory work across banking and financial services before landing at Hargrove. Adrienne had a management style that could be described as precision without ornament. She assigned work, she evaluated work, and when the work was excellent, she said so in exactly those words, and then assigned more of it. In my 3rd month at Hargrove, I was assigned to assist with an internal audit of vendor contract compliance across the firm's Midwestern client portfolio. The audit covered 214 contracts. I completed my assigned portion, 71 contracts, in 11 days instead of the projected 18. I found 4 significant discrepancies in the documentation that the previous review had missed. Adrienne reviewed my notes and said, "How did you catch these?" Said, "I went back to the original policy language instead of working from the summary." She said, "Everyone else works from the summary." I said, "The summary is where the errors hide." She looked at me for a moment and then she said, "I want you on the Dayton National Audit next month." The Dayton National Audit was not a junior analyst assignment. It was a full compliance review of a regional manufacturing client whose financial disclosure practices had raised flags during a routine review. The engagement team was 3 senior analysts and 1 director, and then me. I was 29 years old and I was the youngest person in every room, and I did not say anything about it to anyone in my family because my family had not asked. My father called in November of that year. not to ask how work was going. He called because he had heard, through some network of family acquaintance I had no visibility into, that I was working in compliance. He said, "Compliance? What does that mean exactly?" I said, "It means I review financial records and regulatory documentation to identify inconsistencies." He said, "Like an accountant?" I said, "Not exactly." He said, "Daniel is thinking about going back to school. I told him he should look into business administration. You seem to be doing fine with it." He said, "You should talk to him, maybe give him some advice." I said, "Tell Daniel I'm happy to talk if he calls me." Daniel never called. I completed the Dayton National Audit in February. Adrian submitted a written commendation for my work to the firm's managing partner. The commendation noted, specifically, my identification of a pattern of retroactive policy adjustments being applied to employee compensation records in a manner that was inconsistent with the client's own documented guidelines. The pattern involved 14 employees and $63,000 in aggregate underpayment across 3 fiscal years. The client was required to conduct a full remediation audit and issue corrective payments. I kept a copy of that commendation in a folder on my personal drive. The folder was labeled Record. It was the same folder I had opened years earlier on the night I decided to stop letting things be uncomplicated. By the time I was 32, I had advanced from junior compliance analyst to senior compliance analyst at Hargrove Risk Solutions. Adrian had been promoted to vice president and had brought me onto 3 additional major client engagements. My salary had reached $78,000. My retirement savings, which I had begun contributing to at the maximum available rate in my first year at Hargrove, had crossed $40,000. Claire Heston at Landmark Wealth Partners had helped me redirect a portion of those contributions into an investment structure she described as appropriately conservative for my risk profile and aggressive for my timeline. I met with her twice a year. I had no debt except a modest balance on a car loan I was paying off ahead of schedule. My brother Daniel had enrolled in and withdrawn from 2 community college programs. He was living in Dayton, working a retail management position. My mother called periodically to update me on his situation in a tone that suggested I should feel something about it. I felt something. I did not say what it was. The moment I could have told them, all of it, the program, the commendations, the salary, the audit work, came at a family dinner in June of my 32nd year. My cousin Rita had organized it at a restaurant in Dayton. 11 people. My parents, my brother, 3 aunts and uncles, 4 cousins. It was the first time I had sat at a table with all of them in 4 years. My Uncle Barry asked what I was doing for work. I said I was in financial compliance. He said, "Oh, like taxes." I said it was more complex than that. He said, "Good for you." He turned to Daniel and asked about the retail position, and Daniel talked about it for 12 minutes. I counted. I sat and I ate my food, and I thought about the Dayton National commendations sitting in the folder on my drive, and I thought, not yet. She had no idea what I had become. None of them did, and I had every intention of keeping it that way. The offer from Dalthorpe and Associates Financial Group came in October of my 34th year, and it arrived in my inbox at 7:14 a.m. on a Tuesday while I was reviewing medical records documentation for a healthcare sector client engagement. A records compliance audit that had required me to develop a working fluency in insurance policy language and health documentation standards I had not previously specialized in. The offer was from a recruiter named James Ockeffer at a firm called Bridgepath Executive Search. The title was Compliance Officer, Mid-Market Financial Services Division. The base salary was $112,000. There was a performance bonus structure that the offer letter described as competitive. I read the offer twice. I forwarded it to Claire Heston with a single line. "Does this make sense given where I am?" She responded within the hour, "Yes, take the meeting." I took the meeting, I took the offer. I gave notice at Hargrove Risk Solutions on a Friday afternoon. Adrian shook my hand and said, "I want it on record that I tried to counter." I said I knew and I was grateful. She said, "You'll be running a department inside of 3 years." I said, "Less than that." She smiled. She said, "Less than that." I started at Dalthorpe and Associates on January 8th. By March, Gerald Fitch had signed the letter that told me my $40,000 bonus had become $30,000, and that it was standard, and that I should not make it complicated. By September, The company had created the Senior Compliance Officer role, and the hiring committee, which Gerald Fitch was not on, had reviewed the internal candidates and selected me. My colleague in the compliance department, a man named Thomas Reyes who had been with Dalthorpe for 6 years, was the only person in the office who knew the full arc of what had happened with the bonus. Thomas was Senior Compliance Analyst, a title that now technically reported to mine, and he was the kind of person who noticed the things that weren't being said. He had noticed the tension in March when I returned from Fitch's office. He had not asked directly. He had waited until after the Friday team meeting, and then he had said, "I'm going to the coffee place across the street." "You want anything?" I said, "I'll come with you." We walked across the street, he bought us both coffee, we sat down, he said, "What happened?" I told him, the $10,000, the policy claim, the request for documentation that had not been fulfilled. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You know he did it to Priya last year." I said, "Priya Chandrasekaran in analytics," he said. "She left in August. She didn't say why publicly." I opened my laptop when I got back to the office. I created a new folder in my record archive. I labeled it, Pattern. That was March. By September, when the Senior Compliance Officer appointment was announced and my access credentials were upgraded and the full compensation audit was placed in my jurisdiction, I opened the Pattern folder and I added Gerald Fitch's name to a working document I had begun calling the Structural Review. I had 17 incidents on the list by the time I walked into the HR director's office. A woman named Sandra Oyelaran, who had been with Dalthorpe for 11 years and who had a particular way of becoming very still when she received information she had not been expecting. I sat down across from Sandra Oyelaran. I placed the folder on the desk between us. I said, "I need to walk you through something." She looked at the folder. She looked at me. She said, "How long does this take?" I said, 90 minutes if you have questions. "Less if you don't," she said. "I'll hold my calls." Thomas Reyes had helped me build out the structural review document over 6 weeks without anyone in the organization being aware that we were doing it. He had access to the historical compensation archives through his standard analyst credentials, and he had pulled every bonus cycle record going back 4 years. We had found the pattern in the data on a Wednesday evening at 7:30 p.m. when the rest of the office was empty. Thomas had looked at the screen and said quietly, "This isn't discretionary adjustment, this is systematic extraction." I said, "Yes," he said, "this is going to be a significant thing." I said, "Yes," he said, "Are you ready for it to be significant?" I looked at the screen. I looked at the 17 entries beside Gerald Fitch's name. I thought about the phrase, "Let's not make this complicated." I thought about your being dramatic. I thought about the $18,000 that had disappeared from an account my grandmother had opened in my name when I was 6 years old. I thought about Patricia Owens in my accounting class saying documentation, options, doesn't expire. I thought about the folder on my drive called Record, and the folder beside it called Pattern, and the specific weight of having carried both of them for as long as I had. I said, "I've been ready for a while." I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time. But it wasn't time yet. I was 35 years old. I was Senior Compliance Officer at Dalthorpe and Associates Financial Group. I had built, over 12 years of nights and weekend modules and waitlists, and rejected applications, and unreturned calls and dinners where I was invisible, an expertise in the exact discipline that Gerald Fitch had believed would protect him. I knew how compensation deductions worked. I knew how policy language was constructed to obscure what it was actually doing. I knew which documentation gaps were accidental and which ones were architectural. I knew the difference because I had spent 12 years learning to tell the difference because the alternative of not knowing, of being told something was standard and having no way to prove that it wasn't, was a place I had already lived. I was not going back there. Sandra Oyelaran had held her calls. She had her notepad open. She was looking at me with the focused attention of someone who has just understood that the next 90 minutes are going to change the shape of her week, possibly her year. Across the building, in his office on the 11th floor, Gerald Fitch was having a routine Tuesday. I opened the folder. I said, "Let's start at the beginning." Sandra Oyelaran took notes in a precise, unhurried hand. She did not interrupt. She did not express surprise in any visible way until the 43rd minute of the 90-minute meeting, when I placed the aggregate figure on the table, $287,000 across 17 incidents, 4 fiscal years, 11 employees, and something shifted in her face. Not shock exactly. the particular expression of a person who has suspected something for a long time and is now watching the shape of it become undeniable. She said, "How long did this take you to compile?" I said, "6 weeks," she said. "And Thomas Reyes assisted you?" I said. "He pulled historical records within his authorized access. The pattern identification and structural analysis are mine." She looked at the document. She said, "Gerald Fitch is going to say this is selective interpretation of the policy language." I said, "That's why I included the policy language on page 7 with the original drafting date, the most recent revision date, and a side-by-side comparison of how the language was applied uniformly in all other divisions. His division is the outlier. That's not interpretation, that's arithmetic." Sandra set her pen down. She picked it up again. She said, "I need to take this to legal." I said, "I would recommend it." She said, "This is going to be disruptive." I said, "It already is. I'm just the one who decided to document it." The legal referral went to Dalthorpe's in-house counsel on a Wednesday. By the following Monday, Gerald Fitch had been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. The announcement was sent to the compliance department by Sandra Oyelaran in an email that used the phrase procedural review. Thomas Reyes read the email and walked to my office and stood in the doorway and said nothing for approximately 4 seconds. Then he said, "Arithmetic." I said, "Arithmetic." What happened to Gerald Fitch's case over the following 11 weeks is a matter of institutional record. What happened to me during those same 11 weeks is the part of the story I had not anticipated, because the professional confrontation with Gerald Fitch, as significant as it was not the collision I had been building toward. That collision was older. It was personal. And it arrived, as the most consequential things in my life always seem to arrive, without announcing itself. My brother Daniel called on a Thursday evening in late November. I was at my kitchen table with a glass of water and a document I had been reviewing for a separate client engagement, and when his name appeared on my phone, I looked at it for 2 full rings before I answered. We had spoken 4 times in the previous 2 years. The calls were always initiated by him. They were always about something he needed. This call was different. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him before, a kind of flattened urgency, the way people sound when they've rehearsed what they're about to say and the rehearsal hasn't helped. He said, "Dad is in the hospital, it's his heart." I said, "Which hospital?" He said, "Mercy General in Dayton. They admitted him this afternoon." I said, "What did the attending say?" He paused. He said, "They said it's serious. There was some kind of blockage. Margaret, I need you to come." I said, "I'll drive up Saturday morning." He said, "Mom thinks you should come tomorrow." I said, "I'll come Saturday." I ended the call. I sat with the document for another 20 minutes without reading it. Then I opened my laptop and I pulled up the staff directory for Mercy General in Dayton. I had professional contacts there through a compliance engagement 2 years prior, and I found the name of the attending cardiologist assigned to my father's case. His name was Dr. Elias Mendes. I had met him once, briefly, at a regional healthcare regulatory conference in Cleveland. He was thorough. He was well regarded. My father was in competent hands. I was not going Friday because I was not prepared to go Friday. I needed 24 hours to think clearly about what I was walking into. The medical situation was serious but stabilized. I had confirmed that from the clinical language Daniel had used without realizing it. Language that described an event, managed rather than an event ongoing. What I was walking into was not primarily a medical emergency. What I was walking into was my family, in a high-stress setting, with no buffer between us and 20 years of accumulated accounting. I called Thomas Reyes the next morning before I left for the office. Not about the Fitch investigation, about something else. I said, "I need a name. A good one. Someone who handles financial disputes, specifically retroactive claims involving family asset misappropriation." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How old is the situation?" I said, 12 years. He said, "That's a long tail." I said, "I know." He said, "I know someone. Her name is Vera Hutchins. She's a partner at Castellan and Morse. She's good, Margaret, she's very good." I said, "Can you send me her contact?" He said, "I'll send it now." I had the contact in my inbox by the time I arrived at the office. I did not call Vera Hutchins that day. I drove to Dayton on Saturday morning as I had said I would, and I walked into Mercy General, and I stood at my father's bedside and looked at the man who had told me 12 years earlier that I was young and would find a way, and I felt not what I expected to feel. I felt something quieter, something closer to clarity than to anger. He was 68 years old. He looked smaller than I remembered. His health insurance coverage had lapsed 2 years ago. Daniel mentioned this in the hallway, in a tone that suggested it was somehow surprising, and the financial exposure from the hospitalization was going to be significant. I said, "Has anyone spoken with the hospital's financial counselor?" Daniel said, "Not yet. We've been dealing with, it's been a lot." I said, "I'll speak with them Monday." My mother said from the chair beside the bed where she had been sitting when I walked in, "It's good that you're here, Margaret. Your father has been asking for you." I looked at my father. He was awake. He looked at me with an expression I did not know how to name. I said, "Hi, Dad." He said, "You look good. You look like you're doing well." I said, "I am." He said, "Good, that's good." That was the full extent of it. I drove back to Cincinnati on Sunday evening. I called Vera Hutchins at Castellan and Morse on Monday morning at 8:15 a.m. She answered on the second ring. I said, "My name is Margaret Calloway. Thomas Reyes referred me. I have a situation I'd like to discuss. It involves a family asset that was redirected without my consent approximately 12 years ago. The amount was $18,000. I have documentation." She said, "Documentation going back 12 years. I said, "My grandmother was meticulous. The account statements are in her estate files. I have copies." Vera Hutchins was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Ms. Calloway, I'd like to schedule a consultation. Are you available this week?" I said, "Wednesday afternoon." She said, "I'll hold 2 o'clock." I called Thomas Reyes that evening. I told him I had made the appointment. He said, "Good, it's the right call." I said I knew. He said, "How are you feeling about it?" I said I was feeling precise. He said he thought that was probably the right way to feel. I said I agreed. I signed the first document on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days after my Wednesday consultation with Vera Hutchins. There was no going back. The consultation had gone for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Vera Hutchins had reviewed the documentation I brought, the original account statements from my grandmother's estate file, which I had requested from the estate administrator 4 years earlier during a period when I had first begun thinking clearly about what had happened and what my options might be. The transfer records showing the $18,000 movement from my named account into the Callaway Freight Solutions operating account, and the receivership filing from First Mercantile of the Miami Valley that confirmed the business had subsequently liquidated without recovery of that sum. Vera had read everything without expression. Then she had said, "This is a civil matter. Statute of limitations is a question we'll need to examine closely. Documentation is unusually strong." I said, "My grandmother kept everything." Vera said, "Who was the signatory on the transfer?" I said, "My father," she said, "and you were the account beneficiary." I said, "Since I was 6 years old, my name was on every statement." Vera looked at me. She said, "Ms. Calloway, I want to be direct with you. This is recoverable, but it is also going to be difficult in ways that have nothing to do with the law. Are you prepared for that?" I said, "Yes," she said. "Then let's build the case." The close call came 12 days after I signed the retainer agreement with Castellan and Morse. My mother called on a Sunday evening. She called most Sunday evenings during this period, which was new, a behavior pattern that had changed since my father's hospitalization, and during the call she asked, "Are you talking to anyone about, family things, a lawyer or anything?" I said, "I spoke with someone about estate planning. It made sense to get that organized." She said, "Oh, that's smart. Daniel keeps saying he should do that." I said, "He probably should." She said, "I just wondered, you've been asking a lot of questions about your grandmother's estate files. Your Aunt Lorraine mentioned it." I said, "Grandma's estate was never fully closed. It made sense to review it while everything is coming up with Dad's health situation. Standard financial hygiene." She said, "Of course, of course. I just wanted to make sure you're okay." I said, "I'm fine, Mom. How is Dad feeling today?" She told me about his cardiac rehabilitation schedule. She told me about the medication adjustments. She told me the medical expenses were mounting and that she wasn't sure how they were going to manage the bills without the insurance coverage. I listened. I gave appropriate responses. I did not mention that I had already spoken with the financial counselor at Mercy General and had identified 3 assistance programs for which my parents likely qualified, and that I had sent Vera Hutchins a note about the financial disclosure implications of my father's current asset picture, and that by Thursday morning, I would be reviewing a preliminary draft of a legal notice that Vera's office was preparing. That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. The human moment came on a Tuesday, the week before the formal process began. I was having lunch with a colleague from Dalthorpe's analytics team, a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, who had reached out to me after hearing about the Fitch investigation through an internal communication she had received in her capacity as a former employee who had been affected by his deduction practices. She was quiet and careful, and had brought printed copies of her own compensation records to the lunch. I told her she didn't need to share them with me right now, that the investigation was already underway, that her information would be formally requested through proper channels. She said, "I just want someone to see them." I said, "I see them." She said, "He told me it was standard. He said everyone at my level took the reduction." I said, "He said the same thing to me." She looked at her coffee. She said, "I left because I didn't think anyone was going to do anything. I left because I thought it was me." I said, "It wasn't you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How did you know to document it?" I said, "Someone taught me a long time ago that documentation doesn't expire. I kept that." She nodded. She didn't say anything else for a few seconds. Then she said, "Thank you, Margaret." I drove back to the office thinking about Patricia Owens in my accounting class 20 years ago, saying the words that I had written in a textbook margin and carried forward into every room I had entered since. I thought about the folder labeled Record, and the folder labeled Pattern, and the retainer agreement with Vera Hutchins at Castellan and Morse, and the legal notice being drafted that Thursday. I thought about the specific weight of having built, quietly and over a very long time, something that could not be argued away. Sandra Oilaran sent me an update on the Fitch investigation on Wednesday, a formal memo noting that the internal review had confirmed the pattern I had documented and that the matter was being referred to the firm's external legal counsel for further action. The memo used the phrase financial disclosure irregularities. I filed it in the record folder. Then I opened the draft from Vera Hutchins and read it from beginning to end. The notice was precise. It named my father. It named the account. It named the transfer date. It named the amount $18,000. It cited the relevant civil statutes and explained in clear and documented terms why the claim remained actionable. It requested a formal response within 30 days. My father received it on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after I signed the retainer. He called me that evening. He said, "Margaret." I said, "Dad." He said, "There's a letter." I said, "I know." He was quiet. Then he said, "I don't understand why you're doing this." I said, "I think you do." He said, "That money, Margaret, the company needed it. We were trying to hold things together." I said, "I know you were, and I needed it for school, and no one asked me." He said, "You turned out fine. You turned out better than fine." I said, "Yes, I did. That's not the point." He was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice had shifted into something I didn't hear from him often, something that was trying to reach me from a place underneath the argument. He said, "What do you want from this?" I said, "A formal acknowledgement and the return of what was taken with interest. Vera Hutchins has the figures." He said, "Who is Vera Hutchins?" I said, "My attorney." Another silence. Then, "Your mother is going to, this is going to be very hard for her." I said, "Dad, you had 12 years to find a different way to handle this. I gave you 12 years. I ended the call. I sat in my kitchen for 11 minutes. Then I made tea, and I went back to the document I had been reviewing before he called, and I finished reading it. The family meeting my mother organized happened on the second Saturday of December, at my parents' house in Dayton, the house they were renting now, the original family home having been sold in the receivership. I drove up on a Friday evening and stayed at a hotel 2 miles from the house. I had told them I would attend. I had not told them what I would bring. Gathering was presented as a family discussion. My mother had called it a conversation. She had framed it in the phone call where she extended the invitation as a chance to work things out before anyone did anything that couldn't be undone. I said, "I'll be there at 10. She said, "Margaret, I want you to know that we all love you. This is a family matter and we want to handle it as a family." I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "Whatever you think happened with the money, we can talk about it." Calmly. "Without lawyers." I said, "I'll see you Saturday." My Aunt Lorraine was there when I arrived, my Uncle Barry, my cousin Rita, my brother Daniel, my parents. 7 people seated in the living room with cups of coffee and the collective posture of people who have agreed in advance on the position they intend to hold. My father sat in his usual chair. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had spent the week rehearsing something and was not confident it would work. My mother spoke first. "Margaret, we want to talk about this letter. We think it came as a shock, and we think there may have been a misunderstanding about what happened back then." I set my bag on the floor beside my chair. I sat down. I kept my hands flat on my knees. I said, "What was misunderstood?" my Uncle Barry said. The way these things work in a family business, Margaret, money moves around. It's not always clean. Your father was doing what he had to do to keep the company alive. You benefited from that company your whole childhood, I said. My name was on that account since I was 6 years old. The account was in my grandmother's estate documents as a designated educational fund for me specifically. The transfer was made without my consent or knowledge. I was 27, I was not a minor. My Aunt Lorraine said, You're talking about your own father. I said, Yes. Daniel said, Margaret, can we be a family for 5 minutes here? Without the legal thing, I said, I'm being a family member right now, I'm having a conversation. The legal process continues regardless of this conversation, that's how it works. My mother's hands went still on her coffee cup. She looked at me and she said, We thought you were coming here to find a resolution. I said, I have a resolution, Vera Hutchins sent you the terms. My father said, Margaret. I looked at him. He said, I made a mistake, with the money, I know that. The room was very quiet. He said, I told myself it was temporary, that the company would recover and the money would go back. It didn't happen that way. I said, No, it didn't. He said, What does she want, your attorney? What does she want for you to stop this? I said, Dad, she's not going to stop it. I'm not going to stop it. But I want to tell you something before we go any further because I think you deserve to hear it from me directly. The room was still. I said, I am not doing this because I hate you. I am not doing this because I want to hurt you, or Mom, or anyone in this room. I am doing this because 12 years ago, I needed that money and it was taken from me and I was told I was being dramatic. And I spent 12 years building a life and a career and a specific set of professional skills. And I now have standing and documentation and legal representation. And the amount being requested is fair, and it is documented, and it is going to be settled. That is all this is. It is not a war, it is a settlement. My father looked at me for a long time. He said, How long have you been planning this? I said, I've been building my career, this came later. He said, But you knew, even when you didn't say anything, you were building towards something. I said, I was building toward a life where things that were taken from me could be accurately named and appropriately returned. Yes. My Uncle Barry started to speak. I looked at him. He stopped. I reached into my bag. I took out a folder. I placed it on the coffee table. I said, These are the account statements from my grandmother's estate file. Every statement from 1988 through the transfer date. My name is on each one. This is the transfer record. This is the receivership filing. This is a summary prepared by Vera Hutchins's office at Castellan, and Morse showing the present value of the original $18,000 with 12 years of applicable interest, which brings the settlement figure to $31,400. That was the first document. I had 3 more. I placed the second folder beside the first. I said, This is the documentation Vera obtained regarding the insurance policy that was in place on the Callaway Freight operating account at the time of the transfer. The policy language, which I have reviewed in full, specified that funds held in trust or in third-party beneficiary accounts required separate authorization for transfer. The transfer did not carry that authorization. This is not speculation, this is the policy language. My Aunt Lorraine said, Margaret, this is a family dinner. I said, It's a Saturday morning meeting, and I'm presenting documentation. I placed the third folder on the table. I said, This is a letter from the financial counselor at Mercy General, copied to Vera Hutchins's office, confirming that the medical expenses currently accruing to my father's account have been reviewed for assistance eligibility and that 3 programs have been identified which will cover approximately 60% of the outstanding balance. I handled that last week, before any of this conversation happened, because I'm his daughter. The room did not make a sound. My mother's hand had moved from her coffee cup to her mouth. She was looking at the folders on the table. She was looking at me. She looked like a person who had arrived at a conversation expecting to win it and had discovered midway through that winning it had never been a possibility. Daniel said, You did that, the hospital thing? I said, Yes. He said, And you still sent the legal letter? I said, Both things are true at the same time, Daniel. I can help with the medical situation because he's my father and because I have the professional knowledge and the contacts to do it. And I can also require that what was taken from me be returned. Those aren't contradictions. My father's face had changed, not dramatically, a quiet change. The kind that happens when a person sets down something they've been carrying. He said, The 4th folder. I said, The fourth folder is the proposed settlement agreement. It's straightforward. The amount is $31,400. Payment structured over 24 months if needed. Signed acknowledgement from both signatories, you and me, Dad. No court filing if we sign. Vera Hutchins witnesses. My father looked at the folder. He looked at me. He said, 24 months. I said, or a lump sum, your choice. He said, I want to read it. I said, take your time. My uncle Barry said, Richard, you don't have to, you should have your own attorney look at this. My father said, Barry, I know what I took, I don't need a lawyer to tell me what I took. The room absorbed that sentence. It took a moment. My father reached forward and picked up the fourth folder. He read it for 6 minutes. The room was quiet the entire time. My mother was very still. My brother Daniel had put his coffee down and was looking at the floor. My Aunt Lorraine was looking at a point somewhere past my shoulder. My cousin Rita, who had said nothing the entire time, was looking at me with an expression that might have been respect. My father set the folder down. He said, I'll sign it. My mother said, Richard, he said, Eleanor, I'll sign it. He looked at me. He said, I need a pen. I took a pen from my bag. I placed it on the table beside the folder. I said, Vera Hutchins needs to witness the signatures. She can be here Monday morning or we can go to her office. He said, Monday morning is fine. He signed the settlement agreement on Monday morning, December 14th, in the presence of Vera Hutchins and a Castellan and Morse associate named James who served as the secondary witness. My mother was present. She did not sign, the document did not require her signature, but she sat in the chair beside my father and she watched him sign and she did not say anything. Vera Hutchins shook my father's hand when it was done. She shook mine. She said quietly to me, I'll file the confirmation this afternoon. I said, thank you, Vera. My father and I sat in the living room after everyone else had moved to the kitchen. He said, I'm sorry, Margaret, I should have said that 12 years ago. I said, yes. He said, are we going to be okay? As a family, I said, I don't know. I think that depends on a lot of things that are different from money. He said, I suppose it does. I drove back to Cincinnati on Monday afternoon. The Ohio River was gray and flat under the December sky when I crossed the bridge back into the city. I had a meeting the next morning with Sandra Oyleron about the final phase of the Fitch compliance report. I had dinner that evening with Thomas Reyes and his wife, who had become something close to friends over the previous months, in the way that people become friends when they've built something difficult together and survived it. Gerald Fitch resigned from Dalthorpe and Associates Financial Group on December 19th, citing personal reasons. The formal compliance report, which I submitted to Sandra Oyleron on December 22nd, documented $287,000 in irregular compensation deductions across 4 fiscal years and 11 employees. The company issued remediation payments to all 11 affected employees in January. The remediation to my own account, the $10,000 Gerald Fitch had deducted in March, was issued on January 8th, which was exactly 1 year to the day from when I had started at Dalthorpe. Priya Chandrasekaran received her remediation payment in January as well. She sent me a text message that said, it wasn't me. I replied, it was never you. The first installment of my father's settlement, structured over 24 months at Vera Hutchins's recommended schedule, arrived by bank transfer on February 1st. 24 payments of $1,308.33 each. I put the first payment into my retirement savings account. I put every subsequent payment there as well. My father completed his cardiac rehabilitation program in March. His health improved steadily through the spring. We spoke on the phone twice a month, brief calls, careful and slightly formal, the way conversations are between people who are rebuilding something that was damaged before they fully understood what it was. My mother called less often than she used to. When she called, she asked about work. I told her things I would tell anyone who asked. It was not warmth exactly. It was an attempt at warmth, which is different and harder and probably more honest. Daniel got a job in supply chain management in the spring. He did not call me for money. He called me once in April to ask if I knew anyone in compliance hiring, and I gave him 3 names at firms I had contacts with, and I told him to mention my name if he reached out. I do not know if he did. I was promoted to Director of Compliance at Dalthorpe and Associates in April of the following year. Promotion came with a salary of $158,000 and a bonus structure that was clear, documented, and signed by 3 people above me in the organization, none of whom were Gerald Fitch. My office on the 14th floor now had 2 windows. Thomas Reyes was promoted to Senior Compliance Officer, my old title in the same reorganization. We went for coffee across the street the afternoon the announcements came out, and he said, "You built this." I said, "We built this." He said, "You started it." I said, "Someone started it for me, a long time ago. I just kept it going." There's a woman who still teaches an evening accounting course at a community college in Columbus. Her name is Patricia Owens. She is 62 now, and she still teaches the same way she taught when I was 27, with the particular patience of someone who understands that the people in her classroom at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening are there because they are choosing to be there, against significant odds, and that this choice deserves to be treated with seriousness. I sent her a letter in January, not an email, a letter on paper because that felt right. I told her that she had said something to me 20 years ago that I had written in the margin of my accounting textbook. I told her I had kept the textbook. I told her the phrase had become the spine of everything I built. I told her I thought she should know. She sent a letter back. It arrived on a Wednesday. It said, "I remember you, Margaret. I remember thinking you were going to be someone worth remembering." I read that letter twice. I filed it in a folder labeled Record. It was the best thing in the folder. I am 36 years old. I am Director of Compliance at a financial services firm in Cincinnati. I have retirement savings and an investment structure, and a financial advisor named Claire Heston who meets with me twice a year, and who told me, at our most recent meeting, that I am 11 years ahead of where most people are at my age. I have 2 windows in my office. I have a folder that has been accumulating evidence of my own life for 12 years, and the evidence is substantial and it keeps growing. I thought when this all ended that I would feel triumphant. I do not feel triumphant, I feel settled. There is a difference. Triumph is loud and temporary. Settled is quiet and stays. I think about my father signing that document and I do not feel anger. I feel something more complicated. Something that contains, in the same space, grief and resolution, and the recognition that he was a person who made a wrong choice under pressure, and then could not find his way to admitting it for 12 years, which is a failure of character, but also a recognizable human thing. I did not need him to be a villain for what I did to be right. It was right independent of how I categorize him. That is something I have had to sit with. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. The quietest form of power is the kind you build when no one is watching, because no one can take it away when they don't know it exists. 2. Documentation is not a weapon, it is a record, and records are what separate a true account from an opinion, which is why the people who want to take things from you will always prefer you to have nothing written down. 3. Who you are is not what your family decided you were at 27. It is what you built from everything they underestimated, and you are the only one who gets to define when the building is finished. Was I wrong to spend 12 years in silence, watching my family underestimate me, attending dinners where I was invisible, never correcting the assumption that I had accepted what they had taken, while quietly building the documentation, the credentials, and the legal case that would eventually leave them no room to argue? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.